Hello, everyone. I hope that you're slowly making your way back as we transition to our J. Newman lecture for today. My name is Chanel Robinson, and I am a PhD candidate in systematic theology at Boston College. I also currently serve as the student representative for the Canadian Theological Society, and I'm very delighted to introduce our J. Newman lecturer today, Dr. Frederick Ware. Dr. Frederick Ware is Associate Professor of Theology at Howard University School of Divinity. He began teaching at the school in 2003. Prior to Dr. Ware's appointment to the faculty of the School of Divinity, he served as Assistant Professor of Religion and Philosophy at Stillman College in Alabama. Dr. Ware is the lead editor of the T&T Clark Handbook of African American Theology. He is also the author of African American Theology, an Introduction and Methodologies of Black Theology. In addition to these monographs, he has published numerous essays on African American theology and explored the intersections of Pentecostalism with race, culture, healthcare, and the religion-science dialogue. The title of his presentation today is Afropessimism and the Dogged Strength of Blackness, an assessment of the grounds for a theology of hope. Thank you, Dr. Ware. Welcome. Please begin when you are ready. And everyone, please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you for a very kind introduction. I think you may have seen a description of the paper, a very brief abstract, but let me begin with a few words of preface. Looking at the abstract, I designed and constructed this paper, this lecture, to assess in a minimal way the plausibility of three expressions of optimism over against Afropessimism. And these expressions are framed eschatologically, Christologically, and philosophically. Afropessimism is defined in various ways. It's an intellectual movement, a school of thought, a frame of social and political analysis that asserts Black people are integral to human society, American society in particular, but are ironically excluded from the society and targeted for gratuitous violence. Afropessimists argue that Blackness and other categorizations of minorities are a condemnation to ontological death, the status of nonperson, a thing, without human identity or subjectivity. With Black life described as such, I pondered the question, is there an alternative to anti-Blackness and racial violence? Is there no solution? Is there no end to racism? And do these expressions of hope or any other forms of optimism so conceived adequately inspire social action to address past and present injustices and work toward a sustainable and equitable future? For my preface, I want to talk about some meta issues and how our response to these meta issues have implications for doing theology. And I think that my lecture, my presentation, shows my concern around certain issues, meta issues. And here are two of the issues. One issue is the fragmentation of theology, and the other issue is the existence of multiple canons. A major challenge that I see in theological conferences is to foster dialogue across the full range of the discipline. And the discipline is increasingly fragmented. Theology generally, as the organization of a theological curriculum, is divided into four areas, one of which is the area of systematic theology. Instead of the name systematic theology, some persons may prefer to use the word constructive theology, but whatever name by whatever name, theologians are not conversing and collaborating in significant ways that enrich the discipline, invigorate the church in its mission and ministry, and speak publicly and persuasively to the issues and the divides perplexing human society. Now, this indictment does not mean that there's no one doing very good work. There's very, very good work taking place. But clearly, there are several theologians engaged in initiatives that are impacting society, impacting the church, impacting the academy. So my criticism is intended as a lament of the isolation and the lack of coordination that imperils theology and theological education. Theologians and theological educators work in silos. In the field of systematic theology, as well as in theological education, there's little sense of how it all fits together, not to mention where a text, a particular study, belongs in the curriculum. The texts that transgress the boundaries of the silos are rejected, at the worst, or to the best, politely relegated to the margins. However, some of the very best work that's taking place is happening at the margins, if we would only recognize it. I noticed that in this conference, very different and unusual than I've seen in a few lately, you are addressing a major crisis that it is, if it's dealt with adequately, requires a great effort to restore or instate harmony and integration in the discipline of theology. The second issue, the meta issue of concern to me, is around the theological canon. That's the big elephant in the room, or in our case, the elephant in the Zoom. There's nothing inherently wrong with our operating by canons in a plural sense. The problem, if recognized as such, is the overextension, the overload that leads to a loss of focus, or the narrow constriction that results in the omission of significant texts, traditions, and perspectives. The question confronting us is where the line of demarcation is to be drawn. Which text will be included in the canon? If we are narrowing the canon, which text will be excluded? Will the resulting canon be sufficiently comprehensive for constructing a faith response to contemporary challenges in human life? In whatever manner the theological canon is formed, it will have implications for the theology that we do, especially in terms of issues that are addressed or those particular issues that are being evaded. It may be necessary from time to time to ask ourselves, what's in the canon? And the major crisis that you're addressing requires probably some realignments in the theological canon. For this particular work, I've selected three scholars, one or the fourth, altogether they're four, but one who raises this whole question of an issue around Afropessimism, and then three responses of optimism. W.B. Du Bois, very well noted in his day as a great sociologist, historian, Pan-Africanist, and civil rights activist. Sean Copeland, Professor Emerita of Systematic Theology at Boston College. Victor Anderson, one of my mentors, Professor of Christian Ethics and African American Studies at Vanderbilt University. Now, my concern with these meta issues influences my approach to organizing. So what I'm going to do is be a bit descriptive. I want to be contextual. That is, I don't want to deal with the problem abstractly. I want to be contextual. I'm describing, and then towards the end, I bring the reflection in. So I don't want to deal with the problem in the abstract. And the issue is clearly this. The issue is the dignity and worth of human life and its recovery from injury by violence. That's the issue. Now, that issue can be dealt with from any perspective where there is destruction of human life. So I don't want to deal with it abstractly. I want to look very contextually as I experience it and witness it in my historical tradition. So I began with a very concrete example of oppression and injury, and the responses within that context, that example, to redress, to restore human beings who are suffering from that oppression. From that contextual examination, I want to identify some themes towards the end for some broader conversation from various groups, and I hope that you feel comfortable when we get towards the end, that you'll be willing to engage in conversation about this issue from your own authentic voice as we look at this situation of the dignity and worth of human life and how is it recovered from injury by violence. Let me start with an outline or description of Afropessimism. It's a critical framework. There are several persons now who are doing this work that's labeled as Afropessimism, and the chief architect of that is Frank Wilderson, and he credits his perspective to scholars such as Frantz Fanon, Orlando Patterson, Hortense Spillers as his influences. And there are other writers who are now part of this growing circle of scholars in Afropessimism. Saidiya Hartman, David Marriott, Fred Moten, Jared Saxton, and Calvin Warren. So from Wilderson's writings, it seems that Afropessimism examples, better still scrutinizes the meaning of what it means. What does it mean to be human? With attention to a distinct concept of the human emerging out of Western culture or modernity and spreading across the world. At the same time, the constellation of ideas at the core of modernity, Western culture, was forming, a concept of the human was being constructed. This human lives in society that has constitutional government. This human is rational, able-bodied. This emergent concept of the human is construed over against a radically different other. The human is Homo sapien, scientific language that's drawn from the Latin, meaning the wise or astute human. According to Wilderson, there is more at play than science, that is biology. Social construction is taking place. The human has capacities of knowledge and agency, with influence in the world and mastery over nature. This concept of human represents an ideal for those Europeans who would legitimate their self-understanding and their conquest of lands and peoples. Black people are not a degraded humanity, they are no humans at all. In this new world that's being formed, the American colonies and later the United States, Blacks are chattels, slaves, property, articles of property that are bought, sold, mortgaged, transferred, damaged, and destroyed. They are sentient beings, but not human beings. They're deprived of or not recognized as having the attributes of agencies and capacities associated with the human. The Black slave occupied the lowest position in the modern world. And Wilderson argues that slavery as an institution, a set of laws and practices, of course, has ended. But the condition of Black people remains much the same, occupying the lowest position, living on the margins of so-called human society in the United States. Now, Afropessimism is intended as a thoroughgoing critique of modernity, that is, of the anthropological and the social problem revolving around the status of people whose suffering is part and parcel to the order and operation of the modern world. Now, Afropessimism offers no solution to this violence. It offers no narrative of redemption. It asks questions without premeditated answers. Afropessimism is not a fixation on the past, that is the age of chattel slavery, but rather a recognition in real time, the present, which is the future that was created by chattel slavery. For the crisis-ridden present, Afropessimism claims Black suffering is a problem without solution, if that solution is to be found through the measures of keeping this modern world intact. The end of Black suffering can only be the end of the world, the end of modernity, and the concept of the human that was constructed by it. Now, Du Bois, in his work, said that optimism is not an option at all. He extolled, for example, Sojourner Truth's unwavering faith in ultimate good and a God who somehow manages to achieve it even against extreme odds. Regarding pessimism, Du Bois said, "Pessimism is cowardice. The man who frankly acknowledges the Jim Crow car as a fact and yet live in hope is simply afraid either of himself or of the world. There is not in the world a more disgraceful denial of human brotherhood than the Jim Crow car of the Southern United States. But two, just as true, there is nothing more beautiful in the universe than sunset and moonlight in Montego Bay in Jamaica. And both things are true, and both belong to this world, and neither can be denied. It simply is the light, the stuff that we're given." So long before taking a position about pessimism, Du Bois envisioned the possibilities in what he saw as the dogged strength of Blackness. In his classic text published in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, he said, "The Negro is sort of a seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." Now, Du Bois was not overtly religious, but in his work, whenever he does his sociological work and he moves into making recommendations for social action, he waxes very religiously. And he writes poetry, he writes laments, he writes prayers. And that part of religion is not always showcased in Du Bois, but his empirical analysis does not provide him with a basis for action. is only a way of analyzing what the social situation is. But for motivation and for action, he moves into this type of religious language. Now, he perceived that race does have the potential to guide social groups to great accomplishment, not only for themselves, but also for human civilization. And he wrote an essay titled The Conservation of Races. And he argued long before the science ever refuted the idea of race as a biological category, that he reasoned that there were many contradictions about race at that time, and that race could not be biological. The only way to make sense of it was by looking at it historically or socially. It's not biology. And so he defines race as a group of persons with history and traditions, in other words, ethnicity, striving each in its way to develop some life for themselves. Maybe there's a certain message that comes out of that people striving. And according to Du Bois, between humans, the deeper differences are spiritual, undoubtedly based on the physical, but infinitely transcending them. So he proposes a conception of race that emphasizes the role of Black people in the betterment of the world. And this role is messianic, more precisely a form of Black messianism, expressive of the religious ideal of redemption in which Black people are destined to play a role in history and have a special message for humanity. Now, that's a great task for any persons to take on, to be a messiahs for the world. But redefined around human dignity, mission, and transformation, Du Bois is shifting this conception of race, and he uses religious language, Christian themes, to describe it. At the end of his classic essay, The Conservation of Races, he proposes a 7-point creed. Later, in later works, he will expand the creed to 11 points. And the creed becomes a basis for how he will legitimate or justify the action that he takes in response to the social analysis. So he's very hopeful. He's very hopeful. And this is what he says about life. He says that we must do something. We cannot stand still. We cannot permit ourselves simply to be the victims of exploitation and social exclusion. So he envisions change coming through democracy, the favored form of constitutional government in the Western world. But in his last years of life, he was open to exploring other ways that society could govern itself and explore socialism as a possibility. If cooperation was possible with world powers other than the United States. In his last message to the world, he says, believe in life. Always human beings live and progress to greater, broader, and fuller life. And this is a great piece of wisdom for someone to have lived his age to be 95. He speaks from a life of great wisdom, gifted with longevity. Believe in life. Always human beings live and progress to greater, broader, and fuller life. The only possible death is to lose belief in this truth, simply because the great end comes slowly, because time is long. He recognizes that social change happens over time, over periods longer than an individual lifespan. The end, life in a postmodern world, is something new. In the post-colonial world, life is characterized, according to Du Bois, by modesty, hard work, truth-seeking, and sacrifice. The modesty amounts to self-restraint, income being content with income that is necessary only for healthy living and restraining consumption. Hard work, that is continuous effort and tasks that are worth doing and contribute to life, our society. Truth seeking, activities that lead to knowledge in various forms and application. And sacrifice, surrender personal ease and satisfaction for the common good. Sean Copeland's concept of resurrection hope is articulated in her book titled Knowing Christ Crucified. She claims that Jesus' crucifixion and Black liberation are linked through Black people's suffering, a suffering that is undeserved. Jesus is friend and companion in suffering. He is the one who brings freedom and salvation. His cross is the cost of God's gift of grace, transcending love that transformed the believer and the world. Now, to Afropessimism, I think Copeland would claim that God makes a way out of no way. The wide, gracious, gratuitous circumference of divine grace permeates and showers Black living with love, hope, and new possibility. God's grace unfolds amid Black suffering. And this redemption, this gift of grace, is both spiritual and physical. According to Copeland, Black life thriving in a world of anti-Black violence is possible through the grace that God provides in the place, the location that she calls the tragic subjunctive. That is the mood, that mental space of Black folk that they have in possession in the midst of suffering. God's grace is a twofold operation. God's grace enables Black people to realize themselves in authentic relationship with God and other humans as God defines and values infinitely the humanity that's in each of them. God's grace sustains Black people in hope, fortifying them with courage in their struggle for freedom and resistance to oppression through individual and group strategizing, community mobilizing to action. Copeland says that the blues represents Black people's state of mind. The blues are an illustration of what the tragic subjunctive looks like. She says Black people live at the juncture of the blues. That is, Black people's subversive, transcendent interpretation of living, of America and of the world, and Black eschatological faith. The blues speak simultaneously of the tragic and comic, in mediating a profound and profoundly complex sense of living into and with ambiguity and coherence, sorrow and joy, harshness and sweetness. To engage the blues is to endure, to accept adversity as an inescapable condition of human existence. According to Copeland, Black people's experience of renewal and hope is attested in the numerous illustrations of resurrection and hope found in their spirituals and testimonies of their life experience. The recovery of the families of slain members of Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina, an event that happened in June of 2015, is an example of Black people's experience of resurrection hope following a very terrible crime of hate. Similarly, the Black community in Buffalo, New York is showing resilience in its recovery from the May 2022 mass shooting, perpetuated also by a self-avowed white supremacist. Lastly, I look here at Victor Anderson's conception of creative exchange. Before the rise of Afropessimism, Victor Anderson actually refuted the tendency to reduce Blackness to experiences of suffering. There's more to Black than suffering. In Anderson's Beyond Ontological Blackness, he argues that if Black is a totality, all encompassing, with Black experience being reduced to suffering from or rebellion against whiteness, then the concept of Blackness ultimately depends on whiteness to make sense of itself. It's trapped in this terrible contradiction. Anderson commends the notion of a postmodern Blackness that is a new social identity that is relational and complex. He correctly points out that Black people are not a monolith, a large, undifferentiated block. He says Black identities are continuously being reconstituted as African Americans inhabit differentiated social spaces and communities of moral discourse. Postmodern Blackness not only acknowledges diversity, it also recognizes the good and the bad, the ugliness and the beauty in Black experience. It is unafraid to deal with either or both. He notes in his recent work of creative exchange that places of refuge, such as family and church, can also become places where people sustain the greatest injury. According to Anderson, the problem of Black suffering is resolved by faith in God. And this faith, as well as the formation of beloved community that emerges, comes out of creative exchange. He says that creative exchange is the process by which something, as well as the world itself, comes into fulfillment by drawing upon an available network of relations or meanings. Now, Anderson says that in a creative exchange, faith is not a product of suffering, but it represents one of the options that are present, co-present, as people are existing, living through suffering. It's a choice that people make. In recognition of this process of creative exchange, he claims there is evidence of its reality. He says, I see signs of it wherever racial, gender, sexual, and class identity politics are no longer totalizing, but transcended in creative exchange with other communities. I see it where our loyalties to homes, families, and our churches are qualitatively enlarged by a loyalty to the flourishing of human needs and human goods beyond gender, sexuality, class, and race. Where these possibilities are actualized in creative exchange, there are signs of beloved community. Creative exchange is indicative of God's making a way out of no way, that is an alternative to the suffering and the conflict, which would otherwise overwhelm the believer. So Anderson takes a philosophical approach, and what he does, I see in terms of my assessment, is putting it in some type of neutral language, because he says that you can always describe this thing of creative exchange using Christian language, Christian symbols, but it can easily be described in another set of symbols. So he's identifying something that has some type of neutrality to it. So here's my reflection where I end. It's fair to say that Afropessimism does not have the last word. There are options. And as we look at the atrocities, historically and also currently, pessimism and despair does not have to be our only choice. But the viability of these options, these options of hope, involve, I think, the following things, not in any particular order, but some of the following things. So what does a theology of hope have to do for us? Theology of hope has to address our problem of modernity, the modern world. Unfortunately, theology follows the path of philosophy with a fixation on epistemology. But modernity is not only epistemological problems, that is, what is knowledge, but it's also anthropological and a social problem. What does it mean to be human in just society? And seldom are these problems interrelated in a theological interpretation. So if I want to have a robust theology of hope, it must engage this concept of modernity as both epistemological problem and an anthropological and social problem. A robust theology of hope also has to address how human identity is constructed. What does it mean to be human? Given the issues raised about the construct of the human in modern history, as well as the persistence of race and ethnicity in our modern world. I don't think anytime soon that race and ethnicity will disappear, that human groups will always have some way of distinguishing themselves. And given that this is an act or process of human societies that is identifying themselves and contrasting their identity against other groups, the question becomes for me, how do we take these concepts of identity? How do we construct or reconstruct race and ethnicity, what we have inherited? How do we reconstruct it in meaningful and practical ways that appreciate human difference and emphasize the unity of humankind and promote just society? A very robust theology of hope has to have an element of realism, engage in truth-telling, looking at the very hard, brutal facts of our history, truth-telling, truth-seeking, acknowledging the history that has led to the present crisis, and also the current social practices that intensify that crisis. A robust theology of hope has to grasp the concept of social change. The Christian concept of eschatology may be helpful here. Transformation happens over time. And in the modern world, with the emphasis on instant gratification, there's not always the patience and the discipline to work for social change. When that change is accomplished over long periods of time, long periods that extend beyond the individual lifespan. Now, this is not to justify some type of gradualism, that people should always take it slow, but the mere fact that some structures take time to change. And what does eschatology contribute to the understanding of human history regarding its direction, the goal, the continuous effort needed to not only develop new social structures, but also to maintain these structures? A robust theology of hope must also have a perspective on human agency. We just simply cannot look at people as victims, but also how do we bring agency and how do we motivate agency, sustain agency of those who have experienced violence or the injury? What is the role of the human? What is the role of the divine in redemption as we are seeking redress and resolution to the problem? Where is human agency in this? What do we do? What does God do? I think a robust theology of hope also has to take seriously the idea of universal human community. It's not enough just simply to look at and fixate on difference. That's just a feature of the world, but how do we live with difference? In Christianity, how do we imagine a universal human community? How is it imagined theologically? A robust theology of hope also has to address the concept of redemption, salvation, where salvation becomes spiritual and also physical, concerned with the here and now, and not merely fixating on what is to come. That is not just individualistic and futuristic, but also very material, as Sean Copeland points out in her work, that there is materiality to redemption. And then lastly, I think a theology of hope, given the injury, it must address the concept of reconciliation. How are the oppressed and oppressor reconciled, if possible, historically now, and eschatologically later in universal community? Now, for each of these items or these concepts, they can be interpreted, as Anderson would say, in neutral language, in a framework other than Christianity or maybe possibly in another religion. But given our task and our work as theologians, I muse over how to address this and the resources that I draw upon to interpret hope in a world that desperately needs hope for change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ware, for this really, really fascinating presentation. You've tied together so many different thinkers and threads to kind of help us see how Afropessimism exposes the project of the human. But I think at the heart of what you're inviting us to think about today is this question of hope, this question of eschatology, but also human flourishing. I think that's a thread in your talk today as well. What does it mean for humanity, for subjugated humanity, to be fully alive despite the current configurations of our world? So thank you for your very rich presentation. We have about 10 minutes now for questions, so I'd like to invite you to please raise your hand when you're ready if you have any thoughts or comments or questions that you'd like to share. Okay, Dr. Sweet, I see your hand.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Ware. That was a very powerful, very powerful presentation. I guess when you started off, you talked about some of the meta issues, and about the fragmentation of theology and the multiple canons and so on. And in a way, as you continued, as you sort of moved to the theology of hope, you're sort of saying that in a way that fragmentation has to be overcome in some sense, or those multiple canons have to be somehow sort of transcended. And I don't want this to sound as a negative question, but it still strikes me that we're talking at a level of generalities. And I wondered if you could give me an example of maybe how this theology of hope could actually be instantiated, let's say, in the academy. So if I look at theology as it's done today, I think you're quite right. There are a lot of people working in silos. There may be a lack of coordination. They're not really talking to one another. The theology of hope calls us out of that. But academia is a very, if I could put it this way, conservative environment, right? It sort of conserves structures. It conserves discipline. So could you maybe give me just a bit of a hint about how practically we could make that move from what I think you correctly identified as those meta problems to that much more encouraging theology of hope. And maybe you've already touched on that, but just if you give me like an example or an illustration, that would be very helpful.
Well, that's a good question. I'm in the stage of lament about that. I don't see very much that has happened over the years in terms of how the integration really happens. There might just be persons I know or that I engage with in conversation where we're trying to work over the disciplinary lines. Maybe some schools are trying to formulate a different model for how they deliver their degree programs. So rather than structuring around the lines of the disciplines, maybe they're focusing on competencies that students must have when they finish their theological education. One of my professors did a lot of work in that area of theological education, and some publications towards the end of his life on how we actually do this type of integration. Edward Farley, in one of his last essays, he tries to sketch out how that could happen, and he was working in his context within the Presbyterian Church. And in the Presbyterian Church, how he and others were trying to do that within ecclesial space, but then as a theologian and a scholar, suggesting things that could be done by people in the academic discipline. But that's something that is not broadcast across our various schools and the discipline as a whole. That's one of those texts that's I still think is on the margins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would you think that maybe a push towards a more kind of intercultural theology, would that be something, or is that just going to create another silo? Would you think? I mean, I'm just curious what you would say to that.
No, I just think it's continuous proliferation. And I don't know what everybody else's experience has been in terms of their own education, training, and scholarship. But I think as time goes along, it's just this great proliferation, and it makes it so impossible. When I was starting out and I got interested in learning about this thing called Black theology, I could go and I could read all the books on one shelf in the library, but I can't do that now. And it's just constantly proliferating. So I don't think that the integration happens simply because we're able to integrate everything across all of this grand space, but maybe just the type of individual works or gatherings of people of faith and theologians who will just do theology very differently.
Thank you.
Dr. McCantis Turner, I see your hand, followed by Dr. Dreider Heslin.
I echo the gratitude for this excellent presentation. I really appreciated it a great deal. And you mentioned lament. And so my question is, what do you see as the relationship between a theology of hope and lament? And then a second question is, do you think that Afropessimism can be read as lament? As we think about, for example, stages of lament in the processes, kind of even a declaration sometimes of hopelessness before you get to a memory or a remembrance of what has occurred before that allows for a process of recovering hope. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Lament, I think lament is something that's very biblical. And there's a type of triumphalism that's in Christianity, or especially in American churches, where prosperity preaching, positive thinking, very triumphal, and does not look at religious practices where sometimes the response to the pain and the suffering is actually lament, and working through the pain in order to get to that point of being reconciled to God and to oneself and to what life, this thing of life is. So I think lament is a practice that is not well appreciated. Afropessimism could be regarded as a form of lament, that is just simply putting in front of us what this problem is, and not fabricating or premeditating what the answer has to be, but for us to wrestle with it, struggle with it. And in that process of struggle that we come to find some understanding. So it could be framed in that way. And I think those who are constructing a theology of hope have to sit and wrestle with what the Afropessimists put in front of us. So when Du Bois writes and says that pessimism is cowardice, he's not, he's looking very realistically at what the situation is. And he does, in some of his works, engage in lament. So when you really read Du Bois in his religious type of writings, his poetry, his prayers, there are laments. And he very forthrightly acknowledges the pain, the atrocity, and even asks the question, where is God in the middle of all of this? Why is God silent? What does God have to say? And how do we pull ourselves together and move forward? So when you look at his religious works, which he's not very known for, he does practice lament.
Thank you. I share the challenge of the proliferation of theology today. I often tell my students that I can teach theology up to 1960 and it's super easy, and then it all falls apart. And I talk to them, actually, we live near the Rocky Mountains, and a lot of people are familiar with rivers and deltas, and I sort of talk about how contemporary theology is like that delta that's sort of streaming out and saturating the ground before it goes into the river. And I think I find that to be a source of hope in and of itself. The proliferation is hopeful because it means that we don't need to rely on simply one way of doing theology anymore, that we can actually have lots of different ways, especially when the traditional theology has kind of let us down. And so I wonder about the hope that comes with intersectional theology. And I'm thinking particularly Pamela Lightsey does this work in, Black, lesbian, disability theology. Kelly Douglas is doing this intersectional work. And I'm wondering if maybe it's the work that is specifically coming out of lament that is actually providing hope. And I'm also thinking of Miguel de la Torre, who wrote Embracing Hopelessness. And if that maybe there is something in sitting in the multiplicity, sitting in the various precarities, that itself, just the surviving this is that form of hope. Yeah, just what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Well, in my own work, in my shift and my change, and also my teaching, I'm striving for conversation. I'm thinking of interpretation as a conversation. What can I contribute to the conversation? And I don't think the conversation is helped by any persons who engage from the abstract. Life is always from somewhere. It's always from some location, and it's from some particular context. I have no sense of engagement with someone else if I don't know from which location that person comes. So I think for those who are doing that work, I see it as conversational. And what I do in my own work, in my teaching, I read as much as I can. I tell my students, read everything that you can. And we're just engaging in a conversation. And if you do the very best that you can from your context, it's you achieve self-understanding, and also in some measure maybe contributing to others in the conversation, enriching the conversation. We all would want to be able to say that we are on the cutting edge and that we're leading the conversation in some new direction. It doesn't have to always be profound, but it has to be genuine. That's what I tell my students. It doesn't have to be profound, but it should be genuine. And it's genuine when you honestly engage what is in front of you, the stuff and the substance that's given for you to do your theological work. Now, the great theologians that we look at from the past did not operate out of the frameworks that we use today. They were really contextual. They responded to the issues and the problems of their day. And then over time, we systematized their work and extracted from the social setting from which those works were created, but they were contextual.
Thank you again, Dr. Ware, for these powerful meditations and for this challenge to rethink our own discipline. Everyone, please join me in offering him a round of applause. So our networking lunch will take place at 12:16 Eastern Daylight Time. So that'll give you about 10 minutes to prep your lunch, get your meal ready, and come back for some socializing and networking. Thank you again, and see you soon.